Tonight's guest has been in the music business for over 40 plus years as a drummer and a sound man. He has worked gigs with 7 Rock and Roll Hall of Famers, including, Robin told me to be sure and give you the list. It's impressive for sure, including the Beach Boys, Carl Perkins, Gregg Allman, and Ray Charles. He's also worked with 34 Country Music Hall of Fame members, including Glen Campbell, Waylon Jennings, Roger Miller, Minnie Pearl, Tammy Wynette, and Ray Price. And he was Roy Clark's hand-picked sound man. And Sid also worked on a number of television shows, including Hee Haw, Grand Ole Opry Live, and Roy Clark's Friendship Tour to the Soviet Union, a 2-hour documentary shown on TNN and PBS. And I love it when Sid says he has crisscrossed the country dozens of times, 49 states in private jets, commercial airlines, and tour buses, U-Haul trucks, vans, and Harley Davidson. I'd like to see that. We all want to hear all about it. Here is Sid Pierce.
I am not a singer, but I'd like to start tonight with a sing-along. You know it? Come on. Where, oh, where are you tonight? Why did you leave me here all alone? I searched the world over and thought I found true love. You met another and you were gone. Give yourselves a hand. I'd like to thank Chris and the board for the invitation and for as well as you for showing up tonight. It's kind of weird when you put your life down on a legal pad. But I was born in Gainesville, Missouri in 1956. My dad was the deputy sheriff there at the time, and he carried me in his arms across the street from the doctor's office back to the duplex, went back to work. Shortly thereafter, we moved to Southern California. We lived in the Imperial Valley, down near the Mexico border. It was an agricultural area. And but by the time I was 3 years old, I realized there was something very mystical in our house. And it was my cousin's Chet Atkins Gretsch guitar, the Country Gentleman, a 1957 model, that I was never allowed to touch. I think that's maybe why I don't play guitar now. But anyway, we moved back to Missouri. My dad, he wasn't against the fact that I was learning Spanish as well as English, but he wanted to have more influence on how I was raised. So we returned back to the homestead in Ozarks County, and we started attending, my mom took me to church, and it was Church of Christ. So it was a cappella singing, and I really, really loved those harmonies, especially of my mother and my Aunt Laura Faye Hamilton. They also took me to what was we called house parties, and they were really a community affair. People at houses, they would have bluegrass music, and the kids would play in the yard, and they'd have coffee and cake, and we'd get all sugar high. And but I wanted to be around that music, and I figured out a way that if you're quiet and you're not seen, you can be with the adults. And I just love the smell of the instrument cases. You know, it was like, this is where the magic lives. It wasn't long, and I started, another thing, my parents loved the Grand Ole Opry. They were big music fans, and it helped the fact that they'd grown up along Jan Howard and Porter Wagner, and they knew Slim Wilson, fairly well, and Speedy Hallworth actually had the Tall Timber Express, and his daily route ended in Gainesville, and he would always be at Skeeter's Cafe on the square at the end of his route. So it was like, I'd go over there and just listen to Speedy and see if I could pick up anything. And this, I was like in junior high, and I had a great music teacher that pulled me by the ears over to his corner one time, and he says, let me tell you something, kid. You got some talent, but you're awful lazy. And I said, well, I kind of feel like I thrive around talented, lazy people. That's who I have generated to. be around, you know. So, but anyway, he taught me how to listen. I mean, not listen, hear. He says, now, hearing is a physical thing. Listening is a mental thing. And he'd teach me how to tune the different sections in the band by ear. And, how to tune into those waveforms. And so Mr. High School was a very, very big part of my early life. Once I got into high school, I started a punk rock band. It was 1972. I named the band Shock. We tried to wear makeup like Alice Cooper. My dad being the sheriff at that time, it didn't go so well. And Dad was a contemporary to Buff Lamb. Some of you guys may know that name. They had responded to the Rockaway Beach. Sometimes it's referred to as Riot. But Dad says, I think I made a big mistake. I think I might have taught Buff Lamb how to be mean. He says, we were keeping the peace. And he goes, I didn't really much like it, but he had a big grin on his face. And later at the Finley River Rock Festival, Mickey Owen, the sheriff, was like, Herman, I want you and Buff Lamb to watch that one gate. And he goes, why me with Buff? And he goes, well, maybe you can keep him under control. And he goes, he's going to get you sued. So after the festival is over, and I'm sure some of you might have been there, after the festival is over, Mickey Owen comes up to Dad and says, well, how did it go? And he goes, you're getting sued. So Shock played our junior-senior banquet. We weren't allowed to have dances at Gainesville High School. And so we went out there, and I think there was some lighter fluid involved. And we kind of did the Who thing where we went down to a kind of a flea market area and bought some cheap guitars and destroyed them and made some fake amps and destroyed that. And they unplugged us. They turned the lights off and unplugged us. And then Monday morning there was like a 20-minute speech from the superintendent about evil forces taking over this country. And I guess I said, maybe we ought to change our name to Evil Forces. But I learned how to become a hustler in high school. I started having dances, and everybody in town came. And next thing you know, I was having dances in this little town, and I'd go over to Dora, and I'd go over to Theodosia, and it's all in Ozark County. And I was like, I'm going to be the Bill Graham of Ozark County. And because we didn't have dances, I was able to throw an unofficial prom, which I made enough money to pay off a car. And I'd ask the band guys, I said, hey, do you want to work on this deal, or do you just want a $40 fee? Oh, we'll take the $40. And when it was over, they're like, how much money did you make? And I'm like, none ya. None ya business. But I got out of high school, and I tried to come up here to SMS, and that didn't work out so good. I didn't know how to be a college student. I went back to Mountain Home, Arkansas, where I went to work in a factory called Baxter Lab. And I met another long-haired guy, Tony Chastain. We met in a warehouse. And we talked music for a while, and he was a picker, and I was playing drums, and he was a bass player, and we talked about getting together and doing something, and next thing you know, my job was, I noticed Tony wasn't doing his job right, so I went to my desk and wrote him up. And he goes, man, I thought he was pretty cool. I'm like, well, had a job to do, but that's how Tony and I met. We got a couple of my buddies from Gainesville, and we threw what I call now it was a Leonard Skinner tribute band before they had tribute bands. But we called ourselves Levi Walker, and we did well. And we had a pretty good little following around the Mountain Home area. We were invited to do a concert at a skating rink. And this skating rink, they also booked a jazz fusion band made up of some really salty professional players. We watched them play, and we didn't want to go on. It's like, we don't want to follow that. These guys are real. And but we went on, and everybody loved us, and then they went back on, and everybody left. And we went back on, everybody came back inside, and we're like, what's going on? These guys are way better than us. And they're like, you're playing what's in our tape box. We don't know that stuff. And I'm like, well, okay. I quit the lab, and I drifted around for a year. Me and a buddy of mine, we put 100,000 miles on a Chevy van in 1 year. We just crisscrossed the country along with a little Cocker Spaniel dog. And I'd work odd jobs for a month maybe, and then we'd move on, just being hippies, and ended up in Springfield. That was in the late 70s. And I hooked up with the Vets Club at SMS. And they adopted me, and they allowed me to kind of hang out, and they kind of taught me how to party. All these guys were coming back from Vietnam, and they were going to college for free, and I'd found a home. I was only 18, but I was like their mascot. I could drink beer with them at Pappy's, you know. And then we'd go out in the parking lot and come back in and drink more beer. But it was a blast. I ended up back in Mountain Home at the lab. But my band had moved on, and I went to work for a fiddle player playing Texas swing. And we played a college rodeo circuit for a while. And next thing you know, I got in a band. We called ourselves the Hombres. And we worked there at a club in Gainesville for over a year every weekend. And I thought this was a really good business model. We'd start with country music for the older crowd that was having dinner, you know, the 40-year-olds. And then when they would get tired and go home about 10 o'clock, the young people would show up, and we'd rock out for 2 hours. We turned that club 2 times in one night. You know, we had like 3 bartenders and 5 waitresses that just loved us because they were making bank. But for some reason or another, that kind of dissolved, and I started freelancing drumming. And I did that for about a year, and I only had 2 open weekends for that entire year that I freelanced. Then I decided, well, actually, a guitar player, a friend of mine, turned me on to some contemporary Christian music, and I'm like, I've never experienced anything like this before. I'm Church of Christ. You don't play instruments with music. I mean, but I got to listen to the words and everything, and the music was really, really good. It was like Larry Norman and Phil Keaggy and some of those guys. And he turned me on to a contemporary music magazine, which was like a trade magazine. And in the back, there was a classified ad. Needs sound man, touring sound man, Battle Creek, Michigan. So I wrote them a letter. They wrote me back and said, do you want to travel with us? And I'm like, sure. We don't pay anything. Okay. We'll furnish everything you need, and we're going to work your butt off. Okay. So I jumped on a train in St. Louis and moved to Battle Creek, Michigan, and we did rehearsals for 2 months. I built a PA system along with a veteran, Randy Gardner, who bought the PA and helped me assemble it. Randy Gardner went on to be Ronnie Millsap's engineer, and then he's worked with Steve Warner forever. And just a great guy. But he helped me, kind of taught me what the lingo was and helped get me started. And we started doing high school assemblies. Sometimes we'd do 3 shows a day. And 6 weeks into this, I'm laying down on a carpet in somebody's living room after we had dinner, getting ready to go do our 3rd show that day, going, what have I got myself into? This is way too much work, way too much work. But we stuck it out, and I learned a great deal about sound from those folks because we played every kind of audience imaginable. I had to run it quiet, and then we did one show. It was a high school assembly in Gary, Indiana. The audience was 100% black. And we opened the show within the stone by Earth, Wind and Fire, and they were on their seats. You know, I mean, standing up and going crazy. And then we played an Indian reservation in northern Minnesota, and we're like, oh, they hated us. And the principal's like, no, they loved you, or they would have walked out. And it's like, oh. So, you know, we played prisons, we did it all. I went from there to another group, but it was one with a much harder edge. It was called Sweet Fire, and we were a rock and roll group. We traveled in a 63 Bluebird school bus, and we went around the country in it. One time we were booked to play in Miami, Florida for 10 days, and our next gig was in Eugene, Oregon. Yeah, in a 63 Bluebird school bus. We had a gig, we were playing spring breaks down in Florida, and we were leaving Michigan, and we got down to Kentucky, and we picked up a couple of hitchhikers. And they were deadhead hitchhikers on the road, and we put them in the school bus. Hey, you want to go to Florida? Yeah, okay. So we get to Kentucky, and we get into a winter blizzard. And we're stranded. And our bus gets broke down. And the hitchhikers having this conversation, do we stay with these guys or do we strike out in this winter storm? They stayed. But it was kind of bizarre because we were hanging out at this truck stop, and we're going to sleep in this sleeping bag and just winter it out. And this waitress takes us to her apartment, and we spend the night on her floor for 3 nights until the storm clears and we get our bus done. After that, I get connected. Randy Gardner, who has taught me what I know about sound, hires me to do some shows with Mobil Sound out of Kentucky. And their main accounts is Ronnie Millsap, Barbara Mandrell, the Reverend Billy Graham, and the Amway Corporation. I just was praying for one of the music tours, but they stuck me on the Amway tour. The good thing was I had to cut my hair, and that wasn't good, but I got to eat really nice and drink $300 a bottle of wine. They had an image to keep up, they said. But I eventually got to move over. Well, I did a Billy Graham crusade in Anaheim, California, and I was amazed because the choir was 10,000 voice, and we had a monitor system just for the choir. But it was incredible. Billy Graham was pretty cool. I met Johnny Cash and June Cash there for the first time, and June was a trip. She's just June, you know, telling it like it is. But after Mobil Sound, I came home and the phone didn't ring. And I sat down in a little cabin in Oakland, Arkansas, where Black Oak, Arkansas had their compound and had been a big influence. Matter of fact, I had moved them out of their compound. I was the last person to lock the door on the gate when they left. But I didn't have any direction. And on a whim, I decided to go to a Navy recruiter. And he says, you can do anything. I took the vocab test. Oh, you're in luck. You can do anything you want to do. And I says, well, then I want to join the reserves and go to this school and be out in a year. You can't do that. Well, you said I could do anything I wanted to do. He took it up. He let me cut a deal with them. And they sent me to a tech school for a year where I learned electricity and electronics. And then they sent me home to serve at the reserves here in Springfield. And I thought, wow, now what am I going to do? I walked in on a Friday to Dyna-Mite Sound and Lighting office and met John Gott. John Gott says, let me give you a tour of the place. He told me what he had going on with the moto lights and the cabinet shop and touring with Roy Clark. And he goes, come back Monday, and I want you to talk to Larry Tucker. And so I go back on Monday, and Larry Tucker's there, and we shake hands, and we visit. And he goes, have you ever built this? And I says, yeah, I built 3 of them. Well, have you ever done this? Yeah, I've done that. He goes, you want to go on the road with Roy Clark? Is he still working? He was 52, youth, So I go with Larry Tucker, and we jump in the black Ford Econoline van that Dyna-Mite had, and we take off to Colorado Springs to do a Roy Clark show. And I meet Roy, and I think, wow, what a cool guy. You know, just like what you'd think he'd be. And the band was really professional, sound check. But when the show was over, I was like, oh my, this is incredible. These guys are not only great musicians, they're great entertainers. They have put on a world-class show. We come back to Springfield, and Tucker goes off. Him and Tucker and Hampton, Larry Hampton, go off to do the Chris Christopherson tour, and eventually Tucker goes on to do the Highwayman tour, and I get the Roy Clark gig. And D.C., Cunningham, we did a few shows together. D.C., on my 30th birthday, at a fair up in Illinois, comes to the end of the show, and Roy's getting ready to thank the sound guys. And he turns to me, and I'm on stage with the monitor board, and the spotlight hits me, and there's about 10,000 people out there in the crowd. And Roy says, tonight is Sid's birthday, and the guys in the band got him a little something for his birthday. And about that time, the lights go out. DC has pied me. And the crowd is roaring. And here's what I remember about the rest of that night, DC. We pack up, and I've got pie all over me. And it's dried and crusty now. And my hair is just like, I don't know, ladies. It's like some processing you put in there that just made it like a board. But we get the load out in the truck, and a case moves, and I break a rib. So I'm driving home in Dyna-Mite's truck with pile in my face with a broken rib going, well, that was a heck of a birthday. But we spent a lot of miles crisscrossing this country in that black Ford Econoline van. And Mark West back there was with me that first year. We fashioned that van. We put the amp racks right behind the seats and put the mixing console on top of the amp racks, and in a backpacking sleeping pad and a sleeping bag. When one of us was driving, the other was sleeping. And we had 2 tanks, gas tanks on that van, and we could go 500 miles without stopping except for the necessities. But Mark, thank you. We never had any misadventures except that one time outside Custer's Battlefield when we had 2 flat tires, and that Indian guy just about shook my hand till it was pulverized. Do you know where you're at? Yes.
We get stopped by the Mississippi Highway Patrol.
Oh, yeah. We're coming back from Florida, and we're going through Mississippi, a small town Mississippi, in the middle of the night. And I get pulled over, and this black cop with a real southern accent is like, what you got in there? I says, well, it's sound equipment. We do concerts. About that time, Mark says, you ever heard of Roy Clark? You ever heard of Hee Haw? I ain't heard of no Hee Haw. Is this stuff stolen? No, it's not stolen. We're just trying to get home. You know, he lets us go, but you know Hee Haw? There was one run. It was shortly after I started with Roy. The band they were playing a show in Bellingham, Washington, and then going up on into Canada. And I was returning home to Springfield. And that last show, I remember it being in the high school gym, and the money wasn't there. And that's a big deal, you know. And all bands have a money guy, you know. So our money guy was like Rodney Lay. He was our band leader, and he was the money guy. And he's like, we may not do this show unless we get the money up front because it's sketchy. So they come up with the money for the first show, but the second show they didn't have the money. Roy does it anyway. But as he was leaving that high school gym, headed to his bus to go on up into Canada, I looked at him and I never felt more sorry for a person really in my life, because I'm like, he has worked so hard to be playing in a high school gym, wondering about the money, you know, and I'm like, is this gig gonna last? Am I, you know, I'm just weeks into it. Is it over? You know, should I be looking for something else? 20 years later, I mean, it was just ebb and flow. The next year, Roy just, next thing you know, we're playing some of the best venues there was, and we were back on top. Roy had been the Entertainer of the Year for both Country Music Awards and the American Academy Awards. He'd won every award known to man. One of the things that I thought was so cool about Roy is he dropped out of high school to start a career. He started touring with Grandpa and Ramona Jones. And before that, he had played in his dad's and uncle's family band. And they had opened shows when he was a young man for Hank Williams. You know, and Roy was a contemporary of Elvis and knew Elvis. And he'd worked around the D.C. area. Then he got hooked up with the rockabilly queen, Wanda Jackson. And from there, that's where he met Rodney Lay, his band leader. He met his guitar player, Vernon Sandusky. They both had that Brenda Lee connection. It's where he met Jim Halsey, who got Roy all the television appearances. You know, Jim was really big, and okay, I'm going to get you on the Beverly Hillbillies. I'm going to get you on these variety shows. And he played every variety show there was on TV. He'd tell us on the bus, I was really a flexible entertainer. He says, if they needed somebody to sing a ballad, I'd do it. If they needed an instrumentalist, I'd do that. If they didn't have a comedian, I'd do that. He goes, it kept me working. And then he'd tell the band, he goes, when you're on stage, you got to be on all the time. He says, one of the things that the cameraman told me when I was a sideman even, he says, we can always take a shot at you, Roy. You're always on. We can break away from the principal act and always take a shot at you. And he goes, and that's what I want you to do, guys. He says, you never know. We're playing a gig. My name's on the board, but somebody may look up at you and say, oh, you remind me of my brother or cousin or uncle or somebody I went to high school with, and they're going to fixate on you, not me. Be on. I'm just asking for 90 minutes a day. That's it. Be on. And he held us to high standards. One thing about Vernon Sandusky, though, and I'm learning this, I eventually leave Dyna-Mite, and Roy hires me away from Dyna-Mite. And so I'm on the bus and learning about the guys as we're going down the road. And Vernon Sandusky had played in a band called the Chartbusters and turned down opening for the Beatles. And I'm like, what? You turned down opening for the Beatles? And he goes, yeah, the money wasn't right. And I said, well, I bet you regret that. And he goes, no, the money wasn't right. You know, which reminds me of, for years and years, we worked with this agent that was formerly Bob Hope's manager. And he'd book a lot of conventions and stuff. And he goes, you know, Bob Hope was a businessman. He goes, he'd draw a line in the sand. And he'd say, the check, and then I'll step across that line and be funny. Check. You know, but Vernon was a great guy, and then we had a couple of other guys, James and Jimmy Henley. That Jimmy was a prodigy banjo player at the age of 12, and so he quit school and went on the road with Roy Clark at the age of 12, you know, and stayed with him for 20-some years. But the first time that I went to Nashville to film Hee Haw was exciting. There they were. There was all the Hee Haw gang. And I got a kick out of watching Gaylord Sartain work with Grandpa Jones. Grandpa had really, really hard time reading the cue cards. He'd get tongue-tied and they, oh, cut. Oh, it's all right, Grandpa, just do it again. Gaylord never took a cut the same time. He never did a take the same way every time. It was different. He was a comedy genius, and he's played on movies as long as my arm. But one time we were sitting in a dressing room, and there was a bunch of guys just hanging around, being obnoxious. And Gaylord had put some crunchy peanut butter on his shoe. And he looks over, he goes, "Oh man, I've stepped in some dog crap." And he takes a big old bite of it. German Shepherd. It was funny too, because, we'd play the Opry, and the guys, the Ole Opry stars, they'd always go hang out in the men's bathroom. It was a big men's bathroom, remind me of high school. And they'd tell dirty jokes because they didn't want to tell them around the ladies. I thought that was kind of cute, They were really dirty, though. But when they first started putting Hee Haw together, Sam Lavello had been a production assistant on the Jonathan Winter Show. And he had noticed that the ratings were spiking when they had country guests on. And so there was a couple of writers on that show. They were Canadian writers, and they come up with this concept of Hee Haw. And Jim Halsey was approached by Sam Lavello, and Halsey was, by this time, is managing everybody in country music. I mean, everybody from Tulsa. And Roy's like, "They call it what?" Hee Haw. I'm sure it's just a working title. They'll rename it. And it's about what? He goes, Jim, I'm trying to get out of the cornfield. I've worked all my life trying to get out of the cornfield. I'm not really excited about going back into it. And he goes, "These guys are going to lose their houses if you don't at least do the pilot." Okay, well, you have to tell me that, So Roy goes in and they do a few shows. And the way the production is set up is it's done on the cheap. They go in and they do all the picking and grinning. And then they do all the poof, you're gons. And then they do all the cornfield. And so they go in there and do that for about 3 weeks. They cut everything up. The cast leaves. And then the producer, Sam, goes in there and starts cutting it up and makes a show. Well, the first time they're going in there doing all the takes, the cast is over in the corner going, "We can write better than this. This is horrible. There's no way this is going to work. Yeah, this is get your money and just call it good, And then Sam calls them back and says, "I want to show you the finished product." And then it goes from scene, music, and they're like, "Oh, that's how it goes." Okay, because they're really clueless. But over the course of the next 25 years, that cast became very much like family. They'd do the show in June and in October. It was usually about 3 weeks. Roy would have me there because we'd usually do the Opry and then pick up some of the other television shows being recorded in Nashville, and he'd want me there to sit either in the booth with the engineers doing the live mix or, helping with his guitar rig setup. But it was interesting. I did not realize that Roy was not a member of the Grand Ole Opry. And I was like, "No, wait a minute. Roy Clark is not a member of the Grand Ole Opry." And the night he got inducted, and I don't remember off the top of my head what year it was in the 80s, I think, but everybody at the Opry was astonished that he wasn't in the Opry. He was had been overlooked. And so they made it right, and that was a great deal. Not long after that, we were playing the Grand Ole Opry live television, and the drummer got the beat turned around backwards. So for you non-musical folks, it's just like a train wreck. It's just going, there's no established beat. It's just going, it's like the bass player, Rodney, the band leader, is standing back there by the drummer just going, "Stop! Stop!" He didn't stop. And Roy didn't either. And so 3 minutes later, the guys are leaving the stage and going into a dressing room and closing the door and sitting in silence. We just did that on live television in front of millions of people. Live. television. The door, little knock, open. It's Roy Acuff. Are you Roy's boys? Yes, sir. Well, I reckon you did the best you could. And that's all I'm going to say about that. When I first started working Branson with Roy, DC told me how to get there. I was living here in Springfield, and I just thought, well, go down 65. It's like, no, you don't want to do that. You go down 160, and you go through Reed Spring, and then you go to Lakeview, and you go into Branson, and you'll come out right there by Roy's Theater. Oh, okay. So I went down there, and he goes, be prepared. This is not going to be like any other gig you do. Okay. So I get down there, and, well, there's no stagehands, but I'd been told that. There was no catering, no food. I'd been told that. But when I got down there and I set up Roy's monitor system, the opening act was mad at me because they had to move theirs out of the way. You could have just used our stuff. Hey, those decisions are made at a higher pay grade than mine. You know, I'm just. So when the show came around, I'd got sound checks LA, and the show came around, the opening act goes out there. They had like 4 piano players just doing a rotation. Turn this up, turn this down, turn this up, turn this down. And I was having to remix on knobs for every guy. And by the time Roy's show came on, their mixes was destroyed. That will never happen again. So the second show came along, and I told them before the show, there will be no changes. You play it as it is. It's about the headliner. Sorry, guys, you're only on for 30 minutes. Do the best you can. They hated me. They said bad things. We only played there 6 days that year. So I was like, oh, this is cool. Next year we came in there, we played 9 days, and my dad wanted to see the show. Now, I've been on the road for 2 years now, over 300 days a year. I mean, we hit it hard. My dad comes up to the show. Well, first I call the box office, and they say, I need 2 tickets from my dad. You know, oh, okay. The actual owner of the theater was Jim Thomas. He didn't comp anybody. He comes backstage during the show and starts telling me how I needed to pay up. And I'm like, I'm working. I will see you after the show. And so we had a little confrontation, and I didn't care. I just didn't like being jumped on the way he jumped on me. I jumped back. So they told me that I would never work in that town again. And I'm like, okay. We're in Nashville doing a TV show at the Cannery, and Rodney comes up to me and says, Jim Thomas just called, and he wants to fire you. I says, yeah. I've been meaning to tell. I told you what had happened when it happened. He goes, yeah, I remember. Because I told Jim he doesn't do our hiring and firing. Rodney had my back, and I appreciated that. And the next year we did Branson 16 days. The next year was 30 days. The next year was 90 days. 2 shows a day, 2 and 8. And it was like, man, we're just living our lives in a dark theater. I love the road. I love the road. I love waking up every day in a new place. Sleeping 400 or 500 miles in a bus, getting up, checking in a hotel, grabbing a shower, taking a walk around town, going and playing around the golf, whatever. Doing a show, people being excited. I love that life. Branson, to me, was almost like we were working at a factory that you couldn't change departments when you got bored. Now I'm going to skip forward a little bit because I know I'm running short of time, but eventually Roy bought the theater. There was a reorganization. the old guys left, we get a trickle of new guys coming in. That's where we picked up James Engel back there. James is the one that got the band into playing golf, and we got him into riding Harley Davidsons. And Richard Kennedy back there ended up taking Rodney Lay's place and becoming the band leader and road manager. And Richard got us into martial arts. So we went down the road on Harley Davidsons, which we rode to a lot of our gigs. We rode to Minnesota, we rode to Laughlin, Reno, New York City. We rode those Harleys to shows, but we had a great time. We had a dojo going down the road. We had bikers going down. I got to tell one story. We stopped at Roy was riding with us. We stopped at a California motel, and this Clark says, "You're Roy Clark." "Yes." "You're with these bikers. Are you? Do you need help? Just write something on that paper if you're, they got you against your will or something." I can hear this, and I see Roy's reaction. He does the Jack Benny thing. "Roy, I'm thinking." About 2000, 2005, I started wanting to do something else, and I ended up getting into teaching, and ended up quitting Roy. Got a sound company, started freelancing, worked with Mark West with Down Home and Phil Pitts with Spectacular Sound out of Lebanon, Missouri, and I do a number of shows down in Eureka Springs at the auditorium down there now, and I'm having fun. I play in a couple of bands here locally. I play in Mike Mack and the Sidemen. We're hobbyists. We don't take it serious. And I also play with a little young people's group. They're in their 40s, Springtown 66, and we do a lot of things from Ray Charles to Nirvana. But I think now's the time to open up for any questions.
Okay. I think we've only cracked the surface of this. Do you get the sense that there's so many more stories that we're not going to be able to hear? Okay, we'll take questions, and if you say them loud enough, and I'll repeat them to Sid so we can have the question on the camera. Okay? Yes.
You mentioned James Engel and Richard Kennedy. Tell us about like Justin David, the other guys that were in Roy's band, like Butch McDade and Chris.
Oh, yeah. Well, we had Butch. When I joined the band, Butch McDade was the drummer, and Butch had played with Leon Russell and Willie Nelson and Tanya Tucker, and he was a founding member of the Amazing Rhythm Aces. And I learned a great deal from Butch, and I have his set of drums at home. There was Tom Montgomery was our orchestra arranger when we first started, and Tom had played with Duke Ellington and Miles Davis and was just a great guy. And Chris Gage and Kenny Putnam were both in a band called the Red Willow Band in South Dakota, and Chris is now working, he's lived in Austin for years and years now. He was my roommate on the road, and he's now in the Austin City Limits house band and plays with Bonnie Raitt and all those folks now.
And he played with Jerry Jeff.
And he played with Jerry Jeff.
Yeah, he was in Jerry
as he
Jeff
sang.
Walker's band, yeah.
Hey, Sid, bring us that way.
If you ask me the question, and I'll repeat it for the camera.
I wanted to throw in that Butch McDade played drums from a lawn chair, didn't he?
Butch McDade played drums from a lawn chair.
Yeah, he didn't use a drummer's throne. He used it was a chair from a bowling alley. I can't remember the brand of it, but it came out of a bowling alley, and we set it in the back lounge, and nobody's allowed to sit in it. He just used it at the gig.
Question. Anybody have a question? Okay.
Troy.
Oh, Troy Klontz was our steel player. Troy joined Roy right after high school, and he kind of had a Joe Walsh approach to the steel guitar. But he played with Roy for about 13 years, and then he joined Brooks and Dunn and played from them from the beginning until he passed away last year. I didn't touch on anything about Russia.
Russia. Anybody want to hear about Russia?
I'm sorry? We played two cities. Roy had been there in '76 with the Oak Ridge Boys, but we went back in '88 and we played Leningrad. And in Leningrad, we played this beautiful old theater. But we did some mini concerts. We played this jazz little recital, and we played this avant-garde concert that was like, they had models walking by and painters and music going on. It was weird. They got Roy up, and he sang yesterday when I was young and sat back down. But then we went to Moscow, and then we played down there, and we played at the ambassador's residence. And we made a 2-hour documentary of that. But in Leningrad, I met this music professor out on the sidewalk at the stage door, and I become friends with him. And he'd come back every night. I ended up going to his flat and having dinner with him. And then one day we went out and saw Moscow, and I wasn't allowed to dress. I had to dress like a Russian because he wanted to show me some stuff. And then I got picked up by the KGB because the KGB they were our interpreters anyway. You know, we were surrounded by them, and it was pretty obvious. I mean, we had microphones we could see in our rooms. But because I'd been with this guy, so I thought, the KGB picked me up one day. And they waited till I was away from the group. They put me in the back of a car and started questioning me and said, "What's the real reason for your purpose to our country? We know you have a security clearance in the Navy." And I'm like, okay. Well, they were fishing, and they dropped me off at the consulate's office, and that's whenever I went in, and I'm like, "What was that about?" And they're like, "Oh, they're just fishing. But we got a CIA in your group too." And I spent the rest of the trip going, who's this? Who's the CIA? Well, later we found out because it was Thanksgiving, and we got invited to a Thanksgiving dinner by William Penny, and we went, and William Penny gave me his card, and it says Station Chief CIA in Russian and in English. And he was really liked our group because he graduated from Branson High School. You know. And we were like, okay. And all the other guys at the table were private contractors from Texas, private contractors from Tennessee. And it's like, okay, yeah.
Sid, I'd like to ask, you say that you love being on the road so much. How do you be on the road now that you're not on the road? How do you feed that love for being on the road?
Well, I was with Mark West at the College World Series, what was it, 2 years ago? A year and a half ago, and I got a call from the Belney brothers, and they're like, "Hey, you want to go back on the road?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah, I think, I don't know." And then he says, "You know, what month is that, Mark?"
June.
It's in June. He goes, "We'll get you home next August." And I'm like, "In a month?" And he goes, "No, next August." And I'm like, "Yeah, I want to go on the road, but I know about 2 days into it, I'd be going, those days have passed." Because on a bus, and these guys that've been on the road can tell you, it's the smell of diesel, the smell of human urine, the slamming of bus door, the bathroom door all night long, the brakes, and the rumble strips on the side of the road. You know, other than that, it's great.
Well, what's the most difficult challenge you had being on the road? If that's not enough.
Well, one time I was sitting in the buddy seat because I have this sleep issue. I was always seemed like the last one to bed and first one up. But I'd be sitting up in the buddy seat with the driver, and I looked over him and went, "Huh, I've been divorced for 2 weeks, and I didn't even realize it."
Loss of memory then?
Relationships. My mom, talking to my mom one time, she goes, "Where you at?" And I'm like, "I don't know, but the area code is 347. You know, rolling over in my bed here in Springfield one time and picked up the phone and dialed on. I said, "I need a wake-up call for 8 o'clock." And she goes, "This is the AT&T operator?" And I'm like, "Oh." You know, I talked to my mom one time. She goes, I said, "Mom, I don't know where we're at. I don't know what month it is. I don't know what day of the week it is. I don't know where we're at. I don't know where we came from, and I don't know where we're going. Other than that, things are going great."
Yes.
Tell us about when Butch almost got us kicked out of the hotel in San Diego.
We're doing 2 shows in this club. And man, we played all kinds of venues. But we were playing this club in San Diego, and we were doing there for 2 nights. And we're having a party in Butch McDade's room, and like we did every night. And the phone keeps ringing, And finally, Butch says, they said, the manager's really upset with you. And Butch is like, well, how many rooms does the manager have booked tonight? And then Butch would get on the phone with guys like Hunter S. Thompson and Stephen King. He'd go, yeah, they're fans of the Aces. Then Butch would say stuff like this going down the road. What if we had a bus wreck and killed everybody on here but me? A real joy to be around.
Mike.
Other than Roy, what was your most memorable concert and with who and why?
Other than Roy, what was your most memorable concert with who and why?
I don't know that I could answer that. Glen Campbell was always at the top of my list. I'd always have to, just give him high praise. Him and Roy were great buddies, and we'd play in Las Vegas, and I'd stay up all night listening to them tell stories and hand guitars back and forth. That was great. We did a show one time, I don't remember where it was at, but it was Roy and Tammy Wynette and Keith Whitley. And Keith Whitley got on our bus and was paying his respects to Roy and was talking about his addictions, and Roy was giving him some kind words, and he died a month later. And I knew he was a great one. I mean, you could tell. Recently, I got to do a show down in Branson called Raiding the Rock Vault, and it's the Raiding the Vault series had a country one and a rock and roll, and they're made up of sidemen from all these legends. And so it had the drummer from Mr. Big, Ace Frehley, the bass player from Bon Jovi, guitar player from like Bad Company, and Ronnie James Dio, and the singers from the Babies and Slash, and that was fun. A lot of great memories. Chet Atkins was a great one,
Talk about Chet.
Talk about Chet. Mr.
There's some
Chet.
things I'm not sure Chet would want me to talk about, but I was always amazed that Chet would go back in the room before a show and he'd change his own strings. He didn't have a guitar tech. He'd change his own strings. His fingernails was always immaculately groomed. Roy would joke, he's a guitar player and he's a certified guitar player and I'm a picker. When he goes up here, he knows how he's going to get down here. And when I go up here, I have no clue where I'm at or where I'm going. But I remember Chet would come down and play at one of Roy's charities down in Boca Raton, Florida for St. Jude's, which he raised $1 million for annually for years and years and years. Chet Atkins was down there, and he asked one of our fiddle players one time, he goes, on this part right here, I don't want you to play. Well, this fiddle player liked to imbibe on these charity events and forgot that Chet had told him to lay out and was playing through it. And Chet's over there just like staring a hole through this fiddle player, and he just sawing away. But Chet had this one moment in his show where he would sing a song and dedicate to the memory of his dad, and it made me cry every night. But Carl Perkins had the best stories.
Such as?
Being invited, he's playing in London, and John Lennon invited him to his mansion out in the country, and him and his wife drove out to this John Lennon's residence and went up, knocked on the door, and the door opened. It was John Lennon. He slammed the door in his face, and he's like, well, come on, honey, obviously we're not welcome here. Let's just go back to town. They get to the car, and the door is open, and here's the Beatles and the Stones and Eric Clapton and a number of other British royalty rockers, and they're all just, their mouths are just wide open going, he's here, he's here.
Wow. And he played at the Ozark Jubilee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, I think that's where he played Blue Suede Shoes for the
That's right.
first time.
That's right. You're so smart.
Show for it,
Great man.
down in Texas.
Great man.
Well, it's 7 o'clock. Anybody have any last questions you want to ask? The well is deep. It's amazing. You've had an amazing career. I could listen to him talk 2 or 3 more hours. But we don't have time here. But you could go with us out to eat or something and listen to him or whatever. But anyway, let's give SID Pierce a round of applause. Thank you, Sid.
Thank you.